Welcome to Insanity Fair. I should say probably welcome back to Insanity Fair, because it's been a while since I've made a video, and the reason I'm making this one is because I think I have something to say which is important. I've just watched a very interesting talk. I'll post the link below. No, a conversation rather, between Kamil Paglia and Jordan Peterson on the inevitable subject, really, of the breakdown of civilization that's represented by the takeover of universities by how to put this, by the gender madness, really, is what it is. But that's too simple, because that's the result of a much longer process of the takeover of department after department by what used to be women's studies people. Before that it was feminists, and they've progressed now to being gender studies people, and there's a strong focus on what are called trans issues, and this has now reached Britain. Kamil Paglia is obviously American and Jordan Peterson is Canadian, and so North America is really the source of all of this. But because we speak English in Britain, we're in the firing line, okay? And there was a case recently, a couple of weeks ago in Britain, where a 60-year-old feminist woman was attacked at Speaker's Corner in Hyde Park by some young men, university students, dressed as women up to a point, who described themselves as trans activists, and actually knocked her to the ground, screaming slogans and believing that they were fighting for women's rights, in this case trans women's rights. Now, excuse me, I'm just going to turn this music down. This is Arvo Pärt, by the way, Fratres. Perhaps a little bit too loud. Now, Kamil Paglia and Jordan Peterson, both of whom I recommend, and their conversation is very interesting because he talks about psychometrics mainly. He's a psychologist, and she's a cultural commentator, and also a long-time theorist of transgender issues, you could say. And so they both have very valid points of view. But what I would like to talk about specifically is the idea that they both expressed, and which is now commonly expressed by people who are trying to resist this rising tide of lunacy, that it's all the fault of the French, and that specifically it's the fault of Michel Foucault, who I heard an English internet commentator very charmingly talk about as Michael Foucault the other day. Michel Foucault, who really transformed the study of society, you could say, with his books Madness and Civilization, for example, his history of sexuality. Jacques Derrida, French philosopher, professor of philosophy in Paris, and Jacques Lacan, who actually comes from an older generation, who's a psychologist, but you could call him a sort of philosophical psychologist. These are all, you know, leading French intellectuals. And the first thing I'd like to ask is, I mean rhetorically, because I know the answer, is if it were true that these authors and people like them from Paris were responsible for all this madness, why is it that this has not happened in France? They're all, you know, leading figures in France. People still read them. They are as influential, I think you could say, in France as in the English-speaking world. But this breakdown of the whole academic project, essentially, that's happening in the English-speaking world has not happened in France. And there is a simple reason for it. The thing is that it's not the influence of these authors that is to blame, it is the influence of these authors translated into English. Now, the evidence for that is, well, as I say, that you know, there hasn't been this descent into anything goes, because the language that they use is much more precise. No, that's not the right way to put it. The language that they use in French is precise. When you translate it into English, it becomes this kind of word salad. That is particularly true of Derrida, because he is talking about, you know, tiny shades of meaning in French. And so the attempt to translate that into English is just impossible. Now, this is not something that is specific about French. It's something that's true about philosophical language generally. I remember when I was at university, I did a course on Plato and Aristotle in English. And we read translations only. And at that time, I and my tutorial partner had no Greek. And the man teaching us was an eminent professor of Greek philosophy, and he had no time for this at all. He obviously thought the whole project of learning Greek philosophy without speaking Greek was a waste of time. And having learnt some Greek since then, I must say that I'm inclined to agree with him. The same thing goes for German philosophy. German is closer to English than Greek. So the translations of, I don't know, Kant or Hegel or Wittgenstein are going to be, they're not going to have so many issues actually. But even so, you know, if you want to really understand what these authors said, you need to go and look at the German. And obviously, with Jacques Lacan, Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, especially Derrida, the only way that you can understand what they're saying is to read them in French. And this is something that nobody seems to do. The thing is that they're very popular texts with undergraduates because, in a way, they're so easy. Because you don't, in English I'm talking about, because you read this word salad, and then particularly you start reading the commentators, and you can just say anything, you know. You could talk about, I don't know, the performativity of category deviation in discourse deviation variance. You know, there are people who've done this. You know, they've published joke texts. I once saw a young Chinese graduate student who had stumbled into a department doing this, and he had made the hilarious discovery that he could just do that with a Chinese accent, and he didn't even need to make grammatical sentences or anything, and everybody would just nod and look serious, you know, and he was on the gravy train. Well, this gravy train is, you know, being ridden by thousands of people, increasingly, you know, gender studies orientated people. And let's talk about that now. So once we've established that the postmodern, the translation from French-based postmodernism in English-speaking universities is largely based on just talking nonsense, you know, with this vocabulary that's been borrowed from the French translations, but with the ideas removed. In Paris, these ideas are still discussed, you know, quite seriously, and it's not just nonsense. You know, you can discuss it. Derrida, you know, I think is a kind of dead end in a way, because it's difficult to go any further than Derrida. But you know, there's a whole French intellectual way of dealing with intellectual issues, which it's not really so important to go into, because the English-speaking academic world just ignores all of this, you know. So anyway, much of this has now been applied. This way of talking has now been applied to gender studies, and I think it's very interesting that this issue has now come full circle, in that the issue that is now front and center is pronouns. There was a case a couple of weeks ago where there was a young man in Georgia at Georgia Tech, I believe is the Georgia Institute of Technology, who called the police to say that a young white male, meaning himself, was prowling the campus and was armed with a knife and a gun. The campus police arrived, and this young man approached them in a threatening manner and said, "Shoot me, shoot me, shoot me." They did shoot him, and later they found suicide notes, I believe more than one. So it was a quite deliberate suicide by police. Now the thing is that this young man was a I don't know if it was full-time, but he was a transvestite, and he was the leading light, I believe, in the Georgia Tech Pride movement. And the reason I mention this is because it was the first time that I've seen that really all of the mainstream press that covered this in the English-speaking world called him they, because that's what he wanted to be called, and the idea was that he was a trans person. Now, trans is a term I have a real problem with, because trans is not a word. Trans is a prefix, and it's really cheating, because you have two terms, transsexual and transvestite, as far as I know, and these have now been the idea is that if you say trans, that it's inclusive and you're including these people, and that they're all the same, and that they are in some way transgender. And the thing is that this is just plainly not true. Now, in order to explain why that's not true, we need to look at what gender actually means. Until about the Second World War, the only meaning of gender, the word gender, was grammatical gender. For male and female, that was sex, for animals or for people. But what seems to have happened is that the word sex, as the Western world became more and more obsessed with sex, meaning the sexual act, the word came to seem a little bit naughty. And so the word gender, the grammatical term, was kind of co-opted. And so, for example, now there are birth certificates and things which, instead of asking for sex or specifying sex, they specify gender. But originally it means the distinction between masculine and feminine in many languages. Now, I live in France, which is why I know about the French philosophers. I have friends who are French philosophers. And in France you have gender, you have grammatical gender. Now in the English-speaking world, America especially, but it's something I'll return to, the study of foreign languages is at a very, very low level, and it's logical in a way because the whole world is in fact learning to speak English. So I'll just remind those who may never have studied another language what grammatical gender is and what it means. Now, there's a kind of spectrum. French is at one end of the spectrum. English is near the other end of the spectrum, but not actually at the other end. At the other end of the spectrum are languages like Finnish and Chinese, which have no grammatical gender at all. My mother was a Finn, actually, and although she brought up 5 children in English, and we all spoke English in the family, till the end of her life, she had problems with he and she. Because you know, she thought her first language was Finnish, and in Finnish you don't make this distinction. So she would call men she, and she would call women he. This doesn't mean that she had any, you know, transgender instincts or anything. It was just a fact about the language. In Chinese, he and she are the same. He, she, and it, you could say, are the same word, ta. And so when you speak, you can't tell at all whether it means he, she, or it. They do actually have 3 separate characters for writing the same word for he, she, and it. It's not a question of language group. You know, you might think that European languages are all related, so they all have these same categories. Australian Aboriginal languages, some have genders, some don't, but the ones that do have the same genders as you find universally in all languages. Now, namely, he and she, and you may have a third gender, it's called, which is it. Now, to call it a gender is a little bit misleading because of what people imagine that gender means. Gender comes from the French word, and it's still in use, genre. It's still in use, and it means kind. That's its root meaning. So you say, what kind of thing? Quel genre de truc? And so from that point of view, it is a gender, but it doesn't refer to sexuality, and you can tell this quite clearly, because if somebody does, if somebody either is or claims to be a transsexual, then you do genuinely have to make a choice whether you're going to call them he or she. And if you call them it, then that is just an insult. It's just an attempt to be nasty to them. And the reason for that is that it doesn't represent any kind of third sex. it just represents something that is inanimate, like the chair is it. And so if you call a person it, you are denying their humanity. And so that is the basic distinction that you find. It's actually two different distinctions. It's a distinction between the male and the female, and it's a distinction between what is alive and what is not alive. And in French, I said it's you know, at one end of the spectrum. You don't have that that second distinction between what is alive and what isn't alive in the grammar, because you only have two genders, masculine and feminine. What this means is that everything in the world is divided between male and female. Now, some people have attempted to make this into some kind of yin and yang situation. George Steiner, I remember talking about this on television in the 70s, probably the 1970s, saying that in France you have le soleil, which is masculine, and you have la lune, which is female, feminine I mean, and that the whole world is divided up like this and so on. And I think this is extremely questionable. There are some things, I mean, maybe that example, for example, the sun and the moon, yeah, maybe that does relate to some historical, you know, deep cultural phenomenon. But when it comes to everyday objects, it's just completely irrelevant, you know. One example I give is that if you take a car, if you got into a car in Spain, it would be el coche, so it would be masculine. And you drive the car through Catalonia, and then you come into France, and it suddenly becomes la voiture, feminine. Well, the car hasn't changed. The car has not suddenly changed from being a male car to being a female car. All that's changed is its gender. And so what that means, that illustrates two things. One thing is that as a grammatical category, gender is essentially meaningless. The other thing is that gender is not something that attaches to the object or the person, but it attaches to the word. So another example in French, person, the word I've just used, which, you know, we think of as a kind of neutral term. Well, in French it's la personne, because it comes from Latin and it's feminine. Does that mean that all persons are female? Obviously it doesn't, you know. But the fact that this is the same in all languages, not all languages, I mean, where there is gender, it's always the same. There are a few minor specialised variations in some languages, but the basic picture is it's always the same. And this can be explained by the linguistics of Noam Chomsky, Professor of Linguistics at MIT, Emeritus Professor now, I believe, who revolutionised linguistics from the 1950s on with the concept, among other things, of deep structure. And so what he says is that there is a basic human language faculty, and that whenever people speak language, all languages follow the same deep structures, and that it's just the surface code that changes. And so, for example, if a language has highly developed case, something many of you won't even know what it is, but trust me, some languages, like the Slav languages, for example, have many different forms of a word, depending on a noun, depending on its grammatical place in the sentence, and that makes them very hard to learn for foreigners. English, Chinese, also the isolating languages, they're called, in the literature, don't have this at all because they've abandoned all of those. But what Chomsky says is that they still do have case. It's just that it's not expressed in the surface structure, because all languages have the same basic structure, because we're all human, so we're all speaking human. And so what the the facts of gender differentiation in language show is that this is one of the most basic categories of human existence. Well, in fact, there are two, as I've said. The distinction between what is alive and what is not alive. You know? In, what would you call them, Stone Age societies, actually this distinction was different, because people would think that a particular rock, for example, might be alive. But still, you know, there's this, and you might even think that the whole universe is alive. But, you know, that's a basic distinction that we make and that everybody makes. And the other one that we're talking about now is gender. That male and female is so deeply ingrained in us that we can actually divide the whole world, as the French do, into male and female, and that it's a kind of useful mnemonic system. You'd have to put it like that, that you know, things that have no sex, things that have no sex can still have gender. Okay, so the fireplace, you know, books, a giraffe, whatever it is, they can all have gender. And what that means in, let's return to French and the Romance languages, just in case you don't get it. An example I saw recently is cat in Spanish. They have two words. They have gato and they have gata. Gato is a male cat. Gata is a French cat. In French they also have chat and chat, but chat is a little bit difficult to use because it also refers to the female pudenda. So let's stick with Spanish, gato and gata. So if you want to say you have a white cat, then you have un gato blanco. And if you want to say you have a white female cat, you have una gata blanca. So the word is either masculine or feminine. The word cat is either masculine or feminine, and the word white is either masculine or feminine, and they all have to agree. All adjectives have to agree. The whole language is basically structured around this fact. It's cisgendered, you know, and there's nothing you can do about it. So what that means, for example, is that in the reporting about this young man in Georgia Tech, Schultz his name was, Scott, and he called himself Scout Schultz, you know, R.I.P. I'm sorry for those who loved him. The reporting, as I said, in the English-speaking world, all used they. Now I looked at the reporting in French and Spanish and Italian, and these were people who had read the same agency reports. You know, they'd read reports from Reuters, and presumably they'd also read them in English because it's the international language, you know. And none of them did this they business, because you can't. You just can't do it. It's technically impossible to do this in Romance languages, because even if you did try and choose some gender neutral pronoun, every sentence that you made would still have to make the choice whether this was going to be masculine or feminine. And so what in fact they did was that they all went for masculine. They called him el joven in Spanish, the young man. They called him il giovanotto, the young man in Italian, and everything was just treated as, you know, normal grammatical gender, because there's nothing else that you can do. So what does this mean then for the gender, all of these pronouns that are now creeping in English? The first thing that I think it means is that it represents a really serious attack on our basic logical categories. As I say, I think the distinction between male and female is a universal human attribute, as is illustrated by these deep structures in language. And to deny it, to pretend that it doesn't exist, that it's all just some kind of cultural construct, you know, is actually deeply, deeply damaging to individuals and more generally to society. Because if that's not true, then what is true? You know, that is a biological truth. And so if you're saying, you know, we, the priesthood of gender studies, know that this is not true, and then young people look and they believe you when you say that, then that means that you have the keys to the kingdom. You can control anything, because true and false, for example, true and false is a less, it's a more superficial concept than male and female. Good and bad, whatever it is, you know, those are arguably cultural constructs. Male and female is not, it's a biological truth. And so that's very damaging. And again, looking at France, allegedly under the influence of postmodernist theory in the same way, this has just not got off the ground. There are a few university institutes doing gender studies, études du genre, but none of it is based on French literature. It's all just based on American ideas, either translated or in fact they're just people who've learnt English. You know, many of them have been to America. They've been to, or you know, elsewhere under the influence of this American system. Because you can only really do this in English. There is one interesting exception to this, and this is Sweden, where, as many people will know, they've attempted to introduce a gender-neutral pronoun, hen, which is actually borrowed from Finnish, because, as I said, Finnish has no grammatical gender. And the reason that they can do this in Swedish is because Swedish is actually, and most dialects of Norwegian, is an unusual case among European languages, in that the masculine and feminine genders have merged into what's called common gender. This is just a grammatical feature. It doesn't mean any you know, that they've got any kind of deep you know, transgender instincts or anything like that. It's just arbitrary. But it does mean that it is possible for them to, in a limited kind of way, to start suggesting that that it's the best thing is to stop using he and she. It's not as successful as you might think, but it is very successful among the gender studies people. And so the Nordic countries are the only place outside Britain now where this gender studies stuff can take off at all. But the second point I would like to make, and this is something that I think people should really try and get to grips with, is that it is just American cultural imperialism. It's something that people are not aware of, but that just makes it more insidious. Now, I mentioned before that people in the English-speaking world are bad at languages. But in Britain, in England specifically. Throughout the 19th century, when the English education system was, the modern English education system was being created, the only subjects that were taught in public schools were foreign languages, admittedly dead ones, Greek and Latin. And as that system was replaced with the study of, you know, mathematics and science and other things as well, people switched largely to doing living languages. And so people started studying French and German, both languages with gender as Latin and Greek have gender. And other languages as well, you know, Italian, Spanish a bit, but French and German were the main ones. And so the English do have this, the British do have this European aspect to them, and are in contact with other languages and at least know what they are. Now in America, speaking foreign languages is largely seen as a sign that you're just a wetback, you're an unassimilated immigrant, and they're largely taboo. And the first sign of this is that what's self-evidently the second language of the United States, Spanish, is hardly spoken by anybody. If you ask Americans and you say, do you speak Spanish, they say, oh man, I speak great Spanish. But when you try it, you find that they can't count to 2 in Spanish successfully. And I find this absolutely disgraceful. You know, if I go to New York, you know, I talk to the people sweeping up. They're from El Salvador, Guatemala, you know, Mexico, obviously a lot, and they're just amazed when an Anglo talks to them, you know. And so all of these gender studies people, they all pretend that they're deeply interested in minorities and so on. They can't even be bothered to learn Spanish, one of the easiest languages that there is to learn, and one which they're surrounded with all the time, you know. It beats me, really. But anyway, if they did learn Spanish, they would find that all of this ridiculous nonsense about using different pronouns is completely impossible to do in Spanish. And it's not just Spanish. It's not just some accident, you know. So, England, unfortunately, has seen Britain, the English and the Scottish education systems do seem to be separating out a bit, so it's difficult to say, really. But while other languages are not taboo for the same reasons as in America, as I say, people are giving up on speaking other languages because kids just feel that, that there's no point trying to learn other languages because everybody's learning English. And also boys don't want to learn other languages because they say it is gay. The sad truth. So what's happening now is that this particular model of language, which is an impossible one, where you say, oh no, gender doesn't really exist. Now, yes, the reason for that, let me just talk about that a little bit first. Because the original idea from Andrea Dworkin, who came to Europe, came to England in fact, because she couldn't speak any other languages as far as I know, so she would just talk in English. And she said, no, sex is a social construction. And this seemed to be an interesting idea at the time, you know. Now the problem with this is that science now has shown us this is absolutely false. You know, we know a lot more now about embryology, about endocrinology. There's much better brain imaging, neurophysiology generally, so we just know that that's not true, that biological sex is biologically determined. And so what happened is that they switched over to saying, oh no, it's not sex that's culturally determined, it's gender. And they never had to define what gender meant, so that meant you could say anything, you know. And then if you ask them, well, what is it? Then you say, oh, it's the performativity of the critical discourse variance, you know, or whatever it was. And so now, finally, they have made a move which allows them to be pinned down. They say, oh, it's the pronouns. You know, it's the pronouns. And that there are all these people who are trans, and you mustn't be transphobic. And the proof that you're not transphobic is that you're going to use all of these pronouns. And in Canada, they've actually managed to get this passed into law, which is just unbelievable. So what it means, to draw all these threads together, is that you're basically threatening reality. Reality is to some extent constructed by people's logical categories. As far as any individual is concerned, what is real depends on the logical categories by which his or her mind works. Their mind works, actually, would be sanctioned then. And if you're going to take one of the most basic biological categories that there is, and you're going to say, oh, no, you are not going to understand why not, but you listen to us, do what we say, you know. Then if you reflect that the people who are saying this are in the most privileged American universities, they are in the position of enormous cultural power in the richest country in the world. And what they are doing is they are saying, we are going to make this into a global standard. That's clearly the ambition of feminists. And you know, I've read things where people say, oh yes, well of course the French, they're just going to have to change their pronouns, without any conception of what that means, you know. Now thankfully that is impossible. It's just impossible. In France nobody's even trying it. Nobody's even trying it in Spain or Italy or anywhere where they have gendered language, because, I mean, where they have a surface structure of the language which has formal gender, because it doesn't make any difference, you know, it's a deep structure. But you're saying, well, yes, of course, you know, we know best, because we're American, and you're going to have to do what we say. And this cultural imperialism is now, you can see that the first people to be hit by it are the Canadians, closest culturally to America. Australia has been hit quite hard by it. New Zealand. Britain. Where's it going to stop? Well, I think it's going to stop at the borders of the English-speaking world, but unfortunately those borders are now cultural borders and not just geographical borders, because, as I said, in France now there are a few institutes with people who are spreading these ideas just because they are under the influence of American cultural imperialism. And in Israel, yes, Israel is another country where this happens, because it's got a large English-speaking population, and also because a lot of them are people who have, you know, family or other connections in America. And of course, America takes in graduates from all over the world, and so they're all going to go back, and they're all just going to try and spread this lunacy. And it can't possibly work. It can't possibly work. You'd have to eradicate other languages for it to work. Now, I don't think that that's actually the project of the gender studies people. I don't think so. It might be. Maybe they think that all of the Latinos in America should all stop speaking Spanish so that they can start calling each other Z and they and whatever it is, in order to conform to their ridiculous ideas. But I haven't actually heard anybody saying that. I think what it is more is just that they don't actually understand what gender is. So I hope this little talk has explained some of that to you. Thank you very much.